Margaret Turner was a woman who seemed to have everything. She lived in a grand mansion at the top of a hill that overlooked the entire city. The driveway was long, lined with tall oak trees that danced with the wind. Expensive cars filled her garage, and the walls inside her home were decorated with beautiful paintings and shining mirrors. To everyone who looked at her from the outside, she was the picture of success, a wealthy widow who had it all. But inside that big, silent house, Margaret felt something no amount of money could fix: loneliness. She had lost her husband, Richard Turner, 5 years ago. He had been a kind man, the type who smiled at strangers and treated everyone equally, from his business partners to the gardener who trimmed their hedges. Together, they had built a small company into a great empire. But after his death, Margaret realized that the empire didn't feel like hers. It felt empty and like a castle without laughter. Every morning she woke up to the sound of nothing. No voice calling her name, no footsteps in the hallway. The servants were polite but distant. They did their jobs quietly and left. Even her friends, the ones she had known for years, seemed more interested in her wealth than her well-being. They came to her parties, but they never asked how she was. Not really. At night, when the world went to sleep, Margaret would walk through her home with a cup of tea in her hand. She would pause at the grand piano in the living room, the same one her husband used to play. She would touch the keys gently, hearing the echo of music that wasn't there anymore. Sometimes she would talk to his photo, pretending he was listening. "You'd hate how quiet it's become," she would whisper with a sad smile. Even though she had everything money could buy, her heart ached for something simple: company, kindness, and truth. As the head of her late husband's company, Turner Enterprises, she attended meetings filled with men in suits who smiled too much and spoke too carefully. She could tell they were more interested in their bonuses than in her opinions. They called her Madam Turner with fake respect. Every time she entered the boardroom, they stood up politely, but none of them truly saw her as a person, only as a rich woman with power. Margaret tried to be strong. She tried to fill her days with charity work and social events, but nothing touched her heart the way it used to. She gave away money, sponsored schools, and donated to hospitals, yet she still felt invisible. One rainy afternoon, she sat by the window of her office, watching raindrops race down the glass. Down in the parking lot, she saw one of the janitors, an older man, struggling to push a trash cart through the storm. His uniform was soaked, but he didn't seem to care. He was still working, still moving with quiet determination. For a moment, Margaret wondered what his life was like. Did he go home to a family? Did anyone thank him for what he did every day? She realized how little she actually knew about the people who worked for her. Hundreds of employees filled her buildings, yet she couldn't remember the name of even one janitor or security guard. The thought made her feel strangely guilty. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about how far she had drifted from real life, from ordinary people. She had spent years locked in her tower of wealth, surrounded by polished smiles and empty conversations. What was the point of being rich if it meant being alone? The next morning, Margaret decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She left her office on the top floor and walked down, all the way to the maintenance area. Her expensive heels clicked against the tiles, drawing confused looks from the workers. They weren't used to seeing her down there. But she smiled at them and asked how their day was going. Some were too shy to reply. Others gave short, surprised answers. When she returned to her office, she felt lighter. For the first time in a long while, she had spoken to someone who wasn't trying to impress her. Just honest, hard-working people doing their jobs. She realized she wanted more of that. Real conversation, real connection. That evening, as she looked at the empty chair beside her dinner table, Margaret made herself a silent promise. She would stop living like a ghost surrounded by gold. She would find a way to reconnect with life, with people who reminded her of her husband's kindness, his simplicity, his love for humanity. Little did she know that wish would soon come true. And it would begin in the most unexpected way, through a humble janitor named Daniel Brooks, whose quiet presence would change everything. As the city lights flickered outside her window, Margaret smiled for the first time in months. Somewhere deep inside her heart, a small spark of hope had come alive again. She didn't know it yet, but destiny had already started writing the next chapter of her life. A chapter filled with surprises, lessons, and the most beautiful kind of shock. Daniel Brooks was a man most people never noticed. Every morning before the sun rose, he tied his worn-out boots, packed his old lunchbox, and left his small apartment on the east side of the city. The building he lived in wasn't fancy, cracked walls, flickering lights, and the faint smell of old wood. But to Daniel it was home. It was peaceful, and peace was something he valued more than luxury. He had worked as a janitor for almost 15 years at Turner Enterprises, the company owned by the famous widow, Margaret Turner. Every day he swept the marble floors, emptied bins, and cleaned the glass doors that others walked through, without even looking down. People passed by him as if he were invisible. Businessmen talking loudly into phones, interns rushing with coffee cups, and managers giving orders. But Daniel never complained. He believed that every job had dignity, and he took quiet pride in doing his work well. Daniel had once dreamed of being a teacher. He loved books, especially stories that taught lessons about life and humanity. But life had its own plans. When his father fell sick, Daniel left college to take care of his family. After his father passed away, he took the first job he could find, cleaning offices. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was honest work. And in his heart, he carried the same principles his father had taught him. Do good, even when no one is watching. At the office, Daniel was known for his kindness. When someone dropped a file or spilled coffee, he'd rush to help without being asked. When the security guards worked late, he shared his sandwich with them. He never spoke much, but his smile spoke for him, gentle, calm, and genuine. Every Friday evening, when most employees left early to enjoy their weekends, Daniel stayed a little longer. He would polish the floors, making sure the place looked perfect for Monday morning. Sometimes he'd hum old songs while he worked. The echo of his voice mixed softly with the sound of the mop, a small melody in the silence of the empty building. One day, while he was cleaning the main lobby, he noticed something unusual. The elevator doors opened and out stepped Margaret Turner herself. She rarely came down to the lower floors, and certainly not without her assistance. Daniel quickly straightened his posture, holding his mop awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Margaret looked around the lobby for a moment. Her eyes landed on him. She smiled faintly, not the polite, distant smile she gave at board meetings, but a small, real one. "Good evening," she said softly. Daniel nodded, slightly surprised. "Good evening, ma'am." She paused, watching him clean the wet floor with slow, careful strokes. "You work very late," she said. Daniel chuckled. "Someone has to make sure it's clean when everyone comes back." She tilted her head, curious. "Don't you ever get tired?" He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Sometimes, ma'am. But when I see the floor shining, I feel good. It's not much, but it's something I can do right." That simple answer stayed with her long after she returned upstairs. There was something honest about him, something pure. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't care about her money or her status. He just cared about doing his job well. The next morning, Margaret saw him again, this time outside the building. It was raining, and Daniel was holding a small umbrella over an elderly woman who sold flowers near the gate. He wasn't buying any. He was just helping her keep her cart dry. Margaret watched from her car, quietly amazed. At that moment, she realized something she hadn't seen in years: kindness without agenda. In her world, people smiled because they wanted something: a deal, a favor, a chance to get closer to power. But Daniel's kindness came from a different place, the kind that asked for nothing in return. Later that day, as Daniel cleaned the hallway outside the boardroom, he overheard some executives gossiping. "Did you hear? Mrs. Turner stayed till 10 last night," one said. "Probably signing another deal." "She never stops," another laughed. Daniel smiled faintly, shaking his head. He didn't like gossip, especially about people who worked hard. He quietly moved away, pretending not to hear. He didn't know that his small acts, his humility, his respect, his quiet integrity, were slowly drawing Margaret's attention. She began to notice him more often. Whenever she walked past, he greeted her with the same gentle tone, no matter who was watching. One evening, Margaret spilled her coffee all over a pile of papers. Her assistant had already left, and she stood frozen, unsure what to do. Daniel happened to be nearby and rushed to help. Without hesitation, he took a cloth from his cart, wiped the table, and gently separated the papers to dry. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said with a calm smile. "Coffee stains are just reminders that we're human." Margaret laughed softly. It was the first time she had laughed like that in months. When he finished cleaning, she offered him a tip, a few folded bills. Daniel shook his head. "Thank you, ma'am, but you already pay me for my work. I don't take extra for being decent." She looked at him in surprise. No one ever refused her money. Yet this man in a faded uniform had more dignity than many of her wealthy business partners. That night, as she drove home, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Daniel Brooks, the janitor who didn't just clean floors but somehow cleaned the air around him. His humility had stirred something inside her heart, something that had been asleep for a long time. She didn't know it yet, but this simple janitor would soon change her life forever, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet strength of goodness. It was a quiet Wednesday evening. Most of the office had already gone home, leaving behind only the faint hum of computers and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. The sky outside was painted in shades of gray and gold, with the last bits of sunlight slipping away behind the city's tall buildings. Margaret Turner sat alone in her glass-walled office on the top floor. Papers were scattered across her desk, contracts, reports, and numbers that seemed to have lost their meaning to her. She rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion. Even after all these years, the business world still felt cold. There were meetings full of smiles, but not one of them felt real. She sighed and reached for her cup of coffee. The smell was rich, comforting, a small reminder of warmth in her lonely routine. But as she picked it up, her hand trembled slightly and the cup slipped. Hot coffee spilled across the desk, soaking the documents and dripping onto the floor. "Wonderful," she muttered under her breath, pulling tissues from the box in a panic. But the mess was too much. Papers stained, ink running, her blouse splashed. Just then she heard a soft voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you need help?" Startled, she turned. It was Daniel Brooks, the janitor. He stood in the doorway, holding his mop and a clean cloth, his eyes kind but cautious. He hadn't meant to intrude, but he'd seen the accident through the open door. Margaret hesitated for a moment. She wasn't used to asking for help from anyone, especially not an employee so far below her rank. But tonight she was too tired to care. "Yes, please," she said quietly. Daniel walked in, calm and unhurried. He placed his mop aside and gently began wiping the coffee from the desk. His movements were careful and respectful, as if he didn't want to disturb her papers more than necessary. "I'm really sorry about this," Margaret said, embarrassed. "I can be clumsy sometimes." He smiled. "It happens to all of us, ma'am. Even to the boss." His voice was warm, with a touch of humor that made her smile in spite of herself. She watched him work, how steady his hands were, how focused he looked even in such a small task. Within minutes he had cleaned up the mess completely. He placed the wet papers in a neat stack and handed her a clean tissue. "There," he said softly. "Looks better now. Thank you, mister," she asked, realizing she didn't even know his name. "Brooks, ma'am. Daniel Brooks." "Well, thank you, Mr. Brooks," she said with genuine gratitude. Daniel nodded and turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Wait," she said. "You've been working here for how long?" "Almost 15 years, ma'am." Her eyebrows lifted slightly.
15?
"That's longer than most of my managers." He chuckled lightly. "Well, ma'am, I guess floors don't fire people as easily as bosses do." Margaret laughed, a real warm laugh that surprised even her. For a moment, the office didn't feel cold anymore. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" she offered, almost out of instinct. Daniel blinked. "Coffee with you?" "Yes, why not?" She smiled. "You just saved my paperwork." He hesitated, unsure if it was proper, but her tone left no room for formality. "If you insist, ma'am." She poured 2 cups and handed one to him. They sat across the desk, a rich widow and a humble janitor sharing coffee in the quiet glow of an empty office. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful. Margaret looked at Daniel and saw something rare, calmness. There was no greed in his eyes, no nervousness about being in front of someone powerful, just simple, steady respect. Finally, she broke the silence. "You seem like a man who doesn't mind hard work." Daniel nodded. "Work keeps me grounded, ma'am, and it reminds me that I'm still useful. That matters more than money." She tilted her head, curious. You don't think about money? Not much, he replied honestly. Money can buy food and a roof, sure, but it can't buy peace. And peace is all I really want. Margaret stared at him for a long moment. His words echoed in her heart like a forgotten truth. For years she had lived surrounded by wealth, yet she hadn't felt peace. This janitor with his old shoes and gentle smile seemed richer than most people she knew. When their coffee was done, Daniel stood up. Thank you, ma'am, I should get back to work. Margaret smiled softly. And thank you, Mr. Brooks, for reminding me what real grace looks like. As he walked out, she felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. It was admiration, yes, but also curiosity. Who was this man who spoke so simply yet carried such quiet wisdom? The next day, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about him. She watched from her office window as Daniel went about his duties, greeting everyone with that same humble smile. The executives passed by him without a glance, but she noticed every small act. How he picked up a piece of paper someone dropped, how he helped a new intern find her way, how he always said good morning like he meant it. That evening, as the office emptied once again, Margaret made a decision that would soon change everything. She picked up her phone, called her secretary, and said, "Tomorrow at the business meeting, I want Mr. Daniel Brooks to attend." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "The janitor, ma'am?" her secretary asked, confused. "Yes," Margaret said calmly, "the janitor." And with that, a story began. A story that no one in Turner Enterprises would ever forget. The next morning at Turner Enterprises started like any other. Phones rang, printers hummed, and employees rushed through the halls with folders tucked under their arms. But something unusual was about to happen, something that would shake the entire building. Margaret Turner, the elegant widow who rarely surprised anyone, had made a peculiar decision the night before. She sat at her large mahogany desk that morning, sipping her tea calmly as her assistant Olivia stood beside her with a confused expression. "Mrs. Turner," Olivia began carefully, "I've prepared the agenda for today's business meeting. The executives will all be present at 11. But I just wanted to make sure I heard you right yesterday." Margaret looked up from her cup. "You did? You said you wanted Mr. Daniel Brooks and the janitor to attend the meeting?" Margaret smiled faintly. "That's correct." Olivia hesitated. "Ma'am, he's not exactly part of the management team." "I know," Margaret said gently. "But sometimes the most valuable opinions come from the people no one listens to." Olivia didn't argue. She simply nodded, still puzzled, and walked out to carry out the order. Word spread through the building like wildfire. By mid-morning, everyone was whispering, "Did you hear? The janitor's been invited to the board meeting." "That can't be true." "It is. I saw the email myself." "But why him? What does a janitor have to do with business deals?" Daniel Brooks, the man at the center of it all, was the last to know. He was cleaning the conference hallway when Olivia approached him, holding a neatly printed paper. "Mr. Brooks," she said formally, "Mrs. Turner would like you to attend the executive business meeting at 11. Daniel blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. "The business meeting? You mean the one with the directors?" "Yes." He frowned slightly. "There must be some mistake, ma'am. I think you meant someone else." Olivia shook her head. "Mrs. Turner was very clear. She wants you there." For a moment, Daniel stood frozen. The mop in his hand suddenly felt too heavy. "But I'm just the janitor." Olivia's tone softened. Apparently that doesn't matter to her. When she left, Daniel stood there staring at the paper. He had never been inside the boardroom before, and not once in 15 years. He had cleaned its floors, yes, but only after hours, when the powerful people were gone. He couldn't imagine sitting among them. He looked down at his faded uniform. "What could she possibly want with me?" he murmured. At exactly 11, the grand conference room buzzed with the low hum of conversation. The company's top executives, men and women in sleek suits, sat around the long glass table. Each had a laptop, a cup of coffee, and a look of polite impatience. Then the door opened. Margaret entered first, poised as always, followed by Olivia. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't her. It was the man walking behind her. Daniel. The room fell silent. The clicking of pens stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, some curious, some judgmental, others amused. Daniel walked slowly, unsure if his feet belonged there. He clutched his small notebook nervously, the one he used to jot down cleaning schedules. Margaret smiled reassuringly. "Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats." As she sat at the head of the table, she gestured toward Daniel. "Before we begin, I want to introduce someone special. This is Mr. Daniel Brooks. He's been part of Turner Enterprises for 15 years. A few people exchanged awkward glances. One man cleared his throat. "Mrs. Turner, with all due respect, is this about maintenance issues?" "No," she replied calmly. "This is about perspective." She turned to Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, I'd like you to tell us, honestly, what you see in this company. How people work. How they treat each other. What could be better. Speak freely. No one will interrupt you." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. He wanted to protest, to say he wasn't the right person for this. But when he met Margaret's steady, kind gaze, something inside him told him to trust her. He took a slow breath and began. "Well, ma'am, I'm not sure I understand all the big business things that happen here, but I do know people. I see them every day. When they think no one's watching." He paused, glancing around the table. "Most of them come in looking tired. Some are polite, some are not. I've seen employees crying quietly in the restroom, and I've seen others work late into the night without anyone thanking them. Everyone here works hard, but not everyone feels valued." The room was completely silent. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Daniel continued, his voice steady and humble. "I may just be a janitor, but I know one thing. People don't give their best because they're told to. They do it when they feel respected, when they feel seen." Margaret listened intently, her eyes soft with emotion. Around the room, the executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "I think this company is strong," Daniel said finally. "But it could be kinder. A little kindness can clean more than floors. It can clean hearts." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Margaret smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks, that was beautifully said." Daniel nodded politely and turned to leave, but before he could reach the door, she added, "Oh, and Mr. Brooks, stay. You're part of this discussion now." The executives exchanged shocked looks. Margaret's calm expression didn't waver. She had made up her mind. That day, the janitor sat among directors, and for the first time in years the room felt honest. His simple words had stripped away the layers of formality and pride that usually filled it. And though Daniel didn't realize it yet, his life, and Margaret's, had just changed forever. The air inside the conference room felt heavier than usual. The polished table gleamed under the bright ceiling lights, but the atmosphere was tense, like the quiet before a storm. The executives of Turner Enterprises sat stiffly in their seats, still processing what had just happened. A janitor, a man in a plain gray uniform, was sitting among them. Daniel Brooks sat quietly at the end of the table, his hands folded, his notebook untouched. He wasn't sure where to look. Around him were people in fine suits and silk ties, faces that carried confidence, or perhaps arrogance. He could feel their eyes on him, questioning, doubting. Margaret Turner sat at the head of the table, calm and composed. She could feel the discomfort in the room, but she didn't care. She had brought Daniel there for a reason, and that reason had only just begun to unfold. "Let's continue," she said firmly, her voice steady. "We were discussing the company's new direction, but before we move forward, I'd like everyone to reflect on what Mr. Brooks just said." The executives exchanged uneasy looks. One of them, Mr. Lawson, a senior board member known for his pride, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Turner, With all due respect, Mr. Brooks made some interesting points, but I don't see how feelings and emotions are relevant to quarterly growth. Margaret looked at him with quiet strength. And yet, Mr. Lawson, those same feelings and emotions come from the people who make that growth possible. The room fell silent again. Then turning to Daniel, she said kindly, Mr. Brooks, please continue. Tell us more. Don't hold back. Daniel hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest. He had never spoken in front of so many powerful people before, but he took a deep breath and began again, slowly, honestly. Well, ma'am, he said softly, when I walk through the building every day, I see things most people don't. The young woman at the reception who always smiles even when she's exhausted. The man in accounting who eats lunch alone because no one includes him. The security guards who work overnight but no one even says good morning to them. He paused, glancing around the room. These people keep the company running. They may not wear suits, but they're the reason your lights stay on, your floors shine, and your reports get done. But they're invisible to most. Some of the executives shifted awkwardly in their chairs. Margaret's eyes softened. Daniel continued. When I clean the office late at night, I see the family photos on your desks. They remind me that everyone here, rich or poor, is fighting their own battles. But somewhere along the way, this company forgot that it's made of people, not just numbers. His words landed like stones in still water. The ripples reached every corner of the room. A younger executive, Julia, spoke up hesitantly. He's right, she said. I've been here 3 years and I've never even known the names of our janitors or security guards. That's not right. Mr. Lawson frowned, clearly uncomfortable. We're running a corporation, not a charity. Daniel looked at him with quiet dignity. Sir, kindness isn't charity. It's respect. That simple sentence hung in the air like a bright light. Even Lawson couldn't find words to argue. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her heart swelling with admiration. She could see the shift happening, not just in Daniel, but in everyone present. His sincerity was disarming. His truth was undeniable. Mr. Brooks, she asked, if you were in my place, what would you do differently? Daniel thought for a moment, then said softly, I'd listen more. Not to reports, but to people. I'd make sure everyone here, from the top floor to the basement, felt like they mattered. Because when people feel seen, they give their best. And when they give their best, the company grows naturally. A few heads nodded quietly. For a long moment, the room was silent again. Not out of tension this time, but reflection. The kind of silence that means people are truly thinking. Margaret smiled. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. You've reminded us of something priceless. But she wasn't finished. She turned to her executives and said, I've realized that somewhere along the way we've lost the human touch. We've become so focused on profits that we've forgotten the people behind them. Starting today, that changes. Her tone grew firm, her presence commanding. Mr. Brooks will work with me personally to develop new employee care programs. I want to see better treatment of every staff member, no matter their position. I want Turner Enterprises to be known not only for its success, but for its heart. The room buzzed in disbelief. A janitor working with the CEO? It sounded impossible. Daniel stared at her, stunned. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Margaret interrupted with a gentle smile. You're not just anything, Mr. Brooks. You're exactly what this company needs. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt something powerful, seen. As the meeting ended, people left the room silently, each one deep in thought. But Margaret and Daniel stayed behind. She turned to him and said softly, You spoke from your heart today. That takes courage, he smiled humbly. I only said what I've always believed, ma'am. And that, she said, is what makes you special. As Daniel walked out of the boardroom, the same hallway he had cleaned for years suddenly looked different. The light seemed brighter, the walls warmer. For once, he wasn't invisible. What began as a simple act of honesty had turned into something much greater. A moment that would reshape the company and 2 lives forever. And somewhere deep inside, both Margaret and Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The sun had already begun to set over the city by the time the meeting ended. Through the tall glass windows of the Turner Enterprises boardroom, streaks of orange and pink painted the sky. The building stood tall and proud, but inside something much greater had happened. Something invisible yet deeply felt. Margaret Turner sat alone for a few minutes after everyone left. The echoes of Daniel's words still floated in her mind. Kindness isn't charity, it's respect. She stared out at the skyline, thinking about the years she had spent chasing numbers and titles. Her husband, Richard, used to say, "A company is only as strong as the people who believe in it." Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that. But Daniel's simple honesty had brought that truth back to life. She turned to see him still standing by the door, unsure if he should leave. His posture was humble, his expression respectful. It almost made her smile. "Daniel," she said softly. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know what you just did today?" He looked puzzled. "I just told the truth, ma'am." She shook her head, smiling gently. "You did more than that." He reminded me why I started all of this in the first place. He looked down, slightly embarrassed. "I didn't mean to make a scene." "You didn't," she said warmly. "You made a difference." The next morning, the office was buzzing again, but not with routine work. Something big was coming. Everyone could feel it. Rumors spread like wildfire. "Did you hear? Mrs. Turner's making an announcement today. I bet she's hiring a new director." "No, I heard she's changing management." "But what about the janitor? You think it's about him?" Daniel, meanwhile, was back to his usual duties. He was sweeping the main lobby, pretending not to hear the whispers. He never liked attention. All he wanted was to do his job quietly and honestly. At exactly 10 a.m., the entire company was called to gather in the central atrium, a huge, elegant space with marble floors and shining chandeliers. Employees from every department, from top executives to maintenance staff, filled the area, murmuring with curiosity. Margaret Turner stepped up to the podium, dressed in her usual elegance but with a different kind of glow in her eyes. Softer, more alive. She tapped the microphone lightly. "Good morning, everyone," she began. Her voice carried warmth that people weren't used to hearing from her. "I've called this meeting because something important has come to my attention, something that reminded me of what truly matters." The crowd quieted. Phones were lowered. Even the security guards leaned in to listen. "Yesterday," she continued, "a man spoke in our boardroom. Not a director, not a manager, but a janitor." A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. Heads turned toward Daniel, who stood near the back holding his mop, frozen in disbelief. "This man," Margaret said, smiling softly, "spoke with more honesty and wisdom than I've heard in years. He reminded us that a successful company isn't built on profit alone. It's built on people, on kindness, on respect." Daniel's heart began to race. He wanted to disappear, but the spotlight had already found him. Margaret took a deep breath and said clearly, "From this day forward, Mr. Daniel Brooks will no longer work as our janitor." The room fell utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. A few people gasped. Some whispered. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard her right. She smiled. "Instead, he will be joining our leadership team as the new employee relations advisor. His role will be to ensure that every person, from top to bottom, is treated with fairness, respect, and humanity." The crowd erupted. Some clapped hesitantly. Others looked shocked, but many smiled with genuine admiration. The security guards cheered the loudest. Daniel stood frozen, his mind spinning. Advisor? Leadership team? It didn't make sense. He looked around, wondering if it was some kind of dream. Margaret noticed his disbelief and motioned for him to come forward. "Daniel," she said kindly, "join me." He hesitated, then slowly walked through the crowd. Every step felt surreal. The same people who used to walk past him without a glance were now watching him with awe. When he reached the podium, Margaret turned to him with a proud smile. "You taught us something priceless, Daniel. You showed us that wisdom doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears a uniform." The room broke into applause again, louder this time. Daniel's eyes glistened. He swallowed hard before speaking. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. I don't have fancy words like all of you. I just believe that if we treat people right, everything else falls into place." Margaret nodded. "That's exactly why you're the right man for this job." He smiled shyly, his voice trembling. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll do my best." "I know you will," she said warmly. As they stood side by side, the crowd clapping and cheering, something extraordinary happened, not just to Daniel, but to everyone watching. For the first time in years, people felt proud to work there, proud to belong. Later that day, Margaret's assistant whispered to her, That was bold, ma'am. Some of the board members are surprised. Margaret smiled softly. Good. Sometimes people need to be surprised to start seeing clearly. As for Daniel, when he returned home that evening, he sat quietly on his old couch, staring at the letter of promotion in his hands. He could hardly believe it was real. He looked up at the small picture of his late father on the wall and whispered, "You were right, Dad. Doing good never goes unnoticed." That night, he slept peacefully. Not because he had a new title, but because he finally felt seen, valued, and respected for the person he truly was. And somewhere, deep in her grand mansion, Margaret Turner smiled too. Because in helping Daniel rise, she had rediscovered something far more valuable than wealth, the beauty of kindness. In the weeks that followed Margaret Turner's announcement, something began to shift inside Turner Enterprises. Quietly at first, like the first light of dawn after a long night, people who once hurried past each other in the hallways now began to smile. The cold, polished air of the corporate building started to feel warmer. You could feel it in the way employees greeted one another, in the laughter that echoed faintly through the cafeteria, and in the small acts of kindness that slowly became routine. And at the center of this change was Daniel Brooks. He still wore his old uniform for the first few days, out of habit. It felt strange for him to sit in meetings instead of sweeping floors, but Margaret insisted. "You belong here now," she had told him. He didn't start by making grand speeches or new rules. Instead, he started with something simple. Listening. Daniel spent his first week walking through every department, not as a supervisor but as a friend. He sat with the security guards during their breaks, chatted with the cleaning crew over coffee, and listened to the receptionists who had stories no one ever cared to hear. He asked them what made their jobs hard, what could be better, and what they wished management understood. People were hesitant at first. After all, he was the janitor who became an advisor, but his kindness broke down every wall. He didn't judge or interrupt. He just listened, then he went upstairs. He met with the managers, the team leaders, even the executives. At first, some of them treated him with polite amusement, but soon his calm wisdom started to earn their respect. One afternoon, in a meeting full of department heads, Daniel said something that stayed with everyone. "Every person in this company is like a brick in a building. You can't see them all, but take one away, and the whole thing starts to crumble." Silence followed. Then slow nods. He was right, and they all knew it. Margaret watched all of this quietly from her office. Every day she saw Daniel talking to people who had once been invisible. The janitors, the delivery staff, the night shift crew. And she saw how their faces lit up when they spoke to him. One morning she walked past the lobby and saw Daniel helping a young intern who had dropped her folder. Papers were scattered everywhere, and Daniel was on his knees picking them up one by one. The intern tried to stop him, embarrassed. "Sir, please, I can handle it," she said. Daniel smiled. "Helping doesn't have a rank. It's just the right thing to do." Margaret smiled to herself. His humility hadn't changed, not even after his promotion. Within a month, small miracles began to happen. The staff cafeteria introduced free coffee for all employees. The company launched a new program called Voices of Turner, where workers from any position could share ideas directly with leadership. And at Daniel's suggestion, a new tradition began. Every Friday afternoon, the whole team, from executives to janitors, gathered for a short kindness talk, where anyone could tell a story of teamwork or gratitude. It was simple, but powerful. People started to connect again, not as job titles, but as human beings. One evening after one of these gatherings, Margaret stood beside Daniel in the empty conference hall. The faint light from the setting sun streamed through the tall windows, bathing the room in gold. "You've done something remarkable, Daniel," she said softly. "This company feels alive again." Daniel chuckled. "I didn't do much, ma'am. I just reminded people how to be people." She turned to him, smiling. "That's more than most leaders ever managed to do." For the first time in years, Margaret felt proud, not because of profits or success, but because she could see her husband's spirit living on through Daniel's work. The company that had once been cold and distant now had warmth in its walls. Outside the office, Daniel's life changed too. He was still the same man who took the bus every morning, still carried his lunch in a small metal box. But now, people greeted him wherever he went. One morning, a group of employees stopped him at the entrance with a small surprise, a new nameplate for his office door. It read, Mr. Daniel Brooks, Employee Relations Advisor. A voice for everyone. He laughed softly, running his fingers over the letters. A voice for everyone, he murmured. That's all I ever wanted to be. Later that week, a local news outlet ran a story about Turner Enterprises' transformation. The headline read, From Mop to Management, the janitor who changed a company. Reporters called asking for interviews, but Daniel politely declined. The story isn't about me, he said. It's about what happens when people listen. A few weeks later, Margaret invited him for dinner at her mansion, something she rarely did with anyone from work. As they sat in her garden under soft lights, she looked at him and said, You know, Daniel, before I met you, I thought being rich meant having everything. Now I understand it means giving something. Not money, but respect, kindness, hope. Daniel smiled humbly. And that's what your husband believed in too, ma'am. Her eyes softened. He did, and somehow I think he sent you to remind me. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the night breeze carrying the faint scent of roses. Turner Enterprises had become something new. Not just a business, but a family. A place where people felt seen, heard, and valued. And all because one humble man had dared to speak from his heart. That night, as Daniel walked home under the starlit sky, he felt peaceful. He didn't need luxury or fame. Knowing that he had helped others find dignity, that was enough. And somewhere in that big city full of noise, a small, quiet truth shone like a light. You don't need power to create change. You just need heart. Months had passed since Daniel Brooks became the employee relations advisor at Turner Enterprises, and the company was no longer what it used to be. The hallways that once echoed with hurried footsteps and tense whispers now carried laughter and life. Employees no longer walked with their eyes down. They walked with pride. The cleaning staff wore their uniforms with confidence. Managers smiled more often. Even the executives, once distant and rigid, now shared lunch breaks with the rest of the team. The change was real. The spirit was alive. And in the center of it all stood Daniel. Humble, patient, always the same man he'd been before. But behind all of this transformation there was something else. A story that no one yet knew. A truth that belonged to Margaret Turner. And one she had kept quietly locked inside her heart. It was a cool Friday evening when it all came to light. The company had gathered for its first annual Humanity in Business celebration. An event Daniel himself had suggested. The atrium sparkled with soft lights and fresh flowers. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes, smiling, clapping, celebrating a year of success and unity. Margaret stood at the podium, graceful as always, her silver hair glowing under the warm lights. The crowd fell silent as she began to speak. Tonight, she said softly, we celebrate more than numbers. We celebrate people, every person who makes this company what it is. We celebrate compassion, courage, and change. Applause filled the room. Daniel clapped along, standing modestly at the side of the stage, never seeking attention. When the applause faded, Margaret continued, her voice softer now. But before this night ends, there's something I want to share, something personal. Many of you have asked why I invited a janitor to a board meeting that day. Why him? Why Daniel Brooks? The audience grew quiet. Even Daniel looked puzzled. He had wondered that himself, but never asked. Margaret paused, taking a slow breath. The truth is, Daniel reminded me of someone I loved deeply, my late husband, Richard Turner. A soft murmur swept through the room. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. Richard was not born into wealth. He started as a factory worker, poor, hardworking, honest. When we were young, he would come home with oil on his hands and dirt on his shirt, but there was always kindness in his heart. He treated everyone, and from janitors to CEOs, and with the same respect. She turned toward Daniel, her gaze warm. The first time I spoke to Daniel, I saw that same kindness, the same quiet strength, the same belief that dignity has nothing to do with money or power. It was like meeting a part of Richard again. The room was silent, not a sound, not even a breath. Daniel's eyes softened, his throat tight. He had never expected his kindness to touch someone so deeply. Margaret continued, her voice trembling slightly now. When my husband died, I lost not only my partner but my purpose. I buried myself in work, surrounded by people who cared only for profit. I forgot what compassion looked like. But the night Daniel helped me clean spilled coffee, a simple act done with respect, something in me woke up. I realized how far I had drifted from what Richard believed in. Tears welled in her eyes. That's why I invited Daniel to that meeting. Not as a test, not as charity, but as a reminder that humanity still exists, even in the simplest souls. The crowd was still moved beyond words. Some wiped tears discreetly. Others smiled softly, their hearts full. Margaret stepped closer to Daniel. "Mr. Brooks," she said gently, "you didn't just change this company. You changed me. You brought back the values my husband built this empire on. You gave me something money could never buy, hope." Daniel stood frozen for a moment. Then slowly he stepped forward, his eyes wet but shining. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I only did what anyone should do. Be kind." She smiled through her tears. "And that's why the world needs more people like you." The room erupted in applause, loud, long, and full of heart. But it wasn't the kind of applause that came from admiration. It came from gratitude, for the truth, for the lesson, for the beauty of humility. When the celebration ended, Daniel found himself standing alone on the terrace outside. The night air was cool, and the city below sparkled like a sea of stars. Margaret walked up beside him carrying 2 cups of tea. "You don't like champagne," she said softly, handing him one. He chuckled.
"Tea feels more real," she smiled.
"You're right. Real is what matters." For a while they stood in silence, watching the lights twinkle far below. Then Margaret said, "Do you know something, Daniel? My husband once told me, if you ever lose your way, find someone who still remembers what it means to be good." Daniel looked at her, humbled. "And you found that in me?" She nodded gently. "Yes, you helped me find my way home." Daniel looked out at the skyline, his heart full. "Maybe your husband's still guiding you, just through a different messenger." She smiled, her eyes soft and distant. "Maybe he is." The two stood there quietly, the rich widow and the humble janitor, bound not by money or power, but by something far greater, humanity. And as the wind whispered through the night, one truth glowed brighter than all the city lights below. Real wealth isn't in what we own. It's in the goodness we share.